Thank you, Megan, and thank you, everyone. I especially want to express my delight at being here at the Festival of Faiths that has been so well known in the circles that I move for the very important conversations that are happening here in Louisville, the ripples of which spread all over the country and the world. This is my first time being here for the festival. I'm so delighted to be here for this. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the foundations that support the festival. And I particularly want to thank the Fetzer Foundation. It's been a delight to be working for Fetzer for the last year on the Sacred Story Project, and it's been such a delight in working with a team of 4 other Buddhists on the Buddhist Sacred Story. Fetzer's vision is so much in accord with what I understand the festival to be, so it's a marvelous honor to be here today. I wanted to begin with a personal angle on story. When I was 19 years old, I was a study abroad student in India at a Gandhian ashram college. And part of the curriculum was going out and working in villages, in Gandhian villages. I went to a village with there were 5 American students. We went to a village to help build a road, and we worked all day carrying dirt and rocks in shallow pans on our heads, moving them from one place to another in true Gandhian form without any machinery. But the thing I remember the most that's relevant today is this was a simple village with no electricity. It was very much off-grid. And in the evening, everyone in the village gathered around a Coleman lantern. And everyone, young and old, all the different artisans and laborers and merchants would gather around a Coleman lantern, and the elders would tell stories. We do this, the pandemic, people gathered around their television sets or the devices for stories, but this is an old practice. The stories were stories from the epics, they were stories from the elders' younger lives, they were stories from the history of the village. And even though my Gujarati language was not very good, I could feel the energy and power of those stories shaping the community of the village, bringing people more closely together and binding them in a sense of timeless connection that went back into history, went into the future, but also went in some way beyond time. It was such an honor and privilege to be present for those storytelling events every single evening. Young and old, children falling asleep in their parents' laps, babies crying, and all of that. From ancient times, stories have been our rivers of communication and connection across the generations. And these days, in the activist world, there's talk about creating a new story, that perhaps the way to shape our future is to tell a new story. I think particularly of the work of David Korten, the economist visionary, who says that our current story is a self-destructive story that's all based on materialism and money. And the only way to begin to really shift that is to create a new kind of story. That makes a lot of sense to me. I'm an admirer of David Korten's work. And it's true that we do need new stories for our future, but I wanted to talk a little bit about stories from the past. Because as Megan said, the past, the present, and the future are woven together through story. These kinds of ancient stories connect us with a sense of wholeness and completeness about our experience. Our true spirituality, you could say. In Buddhism, as in many other traditions, stories are powerful because they are direct and personal. They transform us in non-conceptual ways. The Buddhist tradition itself has a tremendously rich philosophic tradition, ritual traditions, but there's always value placed upon the immediacy of personal experience. And so Throughout Buddhist traditions of Asia, stories have played a very important scriptural role. In my own tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, Namtar, liberation stories, are the stories of the saints, like the Buddha, who show the journey to transformation through life's difficulties and obstacles, through the challenges of life that then can transform and show that one can become a bigger, wider, more compassionate, more wise person through the practice of meditation. For our Fetzer project, our Buddhist team dug deeply into the stories of the tradition. We came from 5 different lineages. I was the only Tibetan Buddhist, this included Zen tradition, Pure Land tradition, Theravada tradition, and American Buddhist traditions that aren't so associated with Asian lineages. And we went into the canons of our traditions to look for stories that might be a good candidate, a story that we all could agree on. And we floundered a little bit, but we came across a story that I wanted to share bits and pieces of with you, because it's a story that when we discovered it, it clicked. It was a story that somehow told the core foundational story of Buddhism in a way that we could all connect with and tweak in a way that included angles from our various traditions. It's a story of Kisa Gotami. This is a story from the earliest Pali canon. It's a true story about a young mother who, for a variety of circumstances, had enormous investment in her baby son. She had a young son who then was tragically drowned in a flood, and she could not accept this child's death. And so she carried his dead body around to healers and teachers, asking them to please give her medicine for her sick son. She eventually was sent to the Buddha, and the Buddha, when he saw her, he immediately understood the circumstances. And instead of using magical powers to bring him back to life, which certainly he could have done perhaps, or instead of telling her that he was dead, he sent her on a mission to the nearby village. Asking her, he said, "I will make medicine for you, but first you need to go to the nearby village and go to every house and ask to collect 1 white mustard seed from every home that has not known death." So carrying her baby son with her, she went door to door, and she heard story after story of tragic loss, of the loss of a parent, of an aged parent, of children in sickness, of accidents, all kinds of reasons that people had died. Some were unexplained and sudden deaths. And sadly, nobody could give her a white mustard seed. In hearing these stories, she began to suspect that her son was dead. And by the end of going door to door, every house in the village, she began to actually understand. She went back to the Buddha, heartbroken, and said, "No one could give me a white mustard seed. My son is dead." And the Buddha said, "Every home has mustard seeds, and every home has seen death." In India, every home does have white mustard seeds. This was the core of the story that we've picked. There are a variety of things that follow this story, and you could say that this story was just the beginning. The Buddhist teachings were that the spiritual journey begins with very deep understanding and acceptance of impermanence, of death, of loss, as very much a part of life, and that we are not singled out for suffering. This is something we share with all other beings. Our story traces Kisa's journey through grieving, realizing the fruits of the truth of impermanence, and eventually seeing the golden web of interconnections between all humans as they accept this impermanence. And meditation became her path, it became her life, allowing her to be fully present with this experience, embracing its patterns. She went on to become a Buddhist nun and lived a life in community with teachers and the practice of meditation, and through her long life, she became fully enlightened and is one of the famous early enlightened Buddhist nuns. In the midst of this, she saw the interconnectedness that all of us have, that this is not a solitary private experience, this is something everyone holds in common. And through her practice, through her journey, she developed the tremendous wisdom of the true nature of reality and the overwhelming luminous compassion that embraces all beings who went through a journey like her. This story has become beloved in many different Buddhist lineages and has really entered the popular culture of Buddhism in America. And it's interesting that all of us working on the story were deeply touched by it over and over again, could really identify with Kisa Gotami's journey. And when we shared the story more widely with Buddhists from other countries and lineages, we found that it resonated with them as well. You could say that this kind of journey of starting with personal travail and difficulty and beginning to work with it and accept it and understand why all of this happened brought Kisa deeply into some deeper understanding about how the world works. It also changed the way Kisa related to intense emotions. She began to see that in the heart of every emotion, there is wisdom. And that kind of wisdom begins to develop a bigger and bigger view so that we can have a compassion large enough to hold greater sufferings of groups of people and aspects of the world. This kind of compassion is so crucial for our shared flourishing, our connections with each other. You could say the most important thing is she learned that the way the spiritual path takes us through our suffering, and it's very important that we learn not to turn away from suffering, whether it's our own or others. Still, it was significant to us that Kisa was a low-caste woman, dark-skinned and poor, marginalized in her society, and considered a second-class citizen. Her anguish in losing her son came in part from the status he gave her among her wealthy in-laws and in her community. And later, as a Buddhist nun, she was considered lesser in stature than male monastics, and to this day, nuns are neglected and disregarded in many Asian societies. The social justice aspects of the story are important, but they're not what brought Kisa Gotami peace and freedom. Buddhism, as many religious traditions, is sometimes accused of spiritual bypassing, using spirituality as an escape from the injustices of structural racism and sexism and environmental degradation. This prophetic voice is important, and there's no way we can achieve human flourishing without addressing these issues. But Buddhism asks, can justice be found without a peaceful mind? Which comes first, justice or peace? Or really, can they be separated? Buddhism's offering is that compassion is a missing link, and true compassion arises when we enter through a portal of suffering and impermanence, personally and directly. Then we can glimpse the wholeness at the heart of our existence. We cannot just write a new story from wishful thinking. We need to delve deeply into our current dilemmas with the aid of discernment, understanding who we are, where we have come from, and what we long to do. We wish to live together, flourish together in our wholeness and goodness, and we want to help each other do that. Yes, stories are our medicine, linking past, present, and future, and connecting us deeply with each other and ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. That was so beautiful. When I hear the story of Kisa Gotami, certainly the universal and collective experience of loss comes up, something that all of us know intimately well from being just human, but also the last couple of years we've had through the pandemic. And when I hear the Kisa Gotami story, I want to rush to the end. I want Kisa Gotami to be well right away. And yet, if I stop myself and I put myself in the story and I walk with Kisa Gotami from house to house, hearing again and again the losses in her community, and each time her being turned away without a mustard seed, I know that the process was slow. And it couldn't have been done without her stepping into the narratives of her community. And it was through that stepping into their narratives that she had her own awareness, her own experience of freedom. And so in our world that capitalizes on efficiency and that really isolates the human experience, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to who is this story medicine for, and what are the structures and things in our world that this story could speak to?
Such a great question, Megan. I think one of the things that happens in the world that we live in, we become so overwhelmed with all of the pain and the turmoil and the drama that we want to withdraw into our own little cocoon and seal out the outside world. For some people, the pandemic was an opportunity to seal themselves away more. And it's interesting, in my years of teaching a course in compassion at Naropa, I would run into students who would say, I don't read the news anymore. I just can't relate to it. So one of the requirements for my course was you have to read a news source every day about the pain and suffering of the world, because the whole point is to grow our hearts bigger and become more resilient and more able to lean into the suffering of our world, and also related to our own personal suffering, and recognize that it's only by beginning to open up and begin to understand and accept the fact that this kind of suffering is taking place, can we begin to transform the world. Hiding out in little enclaves, denying what's going on in the world, is not going to have any kind of impact. It's going to further the sense of estrangement and partisanship we have in our world. So beginning to open to suffering, which is really in our compassion training programs at Naropa, this is what it's all about, is learning to open to one's own suffering, the suffering of one's loved ones, of strangers, and also the suffering of the enemy. So beginning to develop greater and greater resilience so that we can begin to really see how suffering works. And suffering isn't just me and my friends, it's also my enemies are suffering. The amount of suffering going into the creation of the war in the Ukraine it's part of the suffering we have to relate with. So this is why this story speaks to me, because beginning to relate in that kind of way and really let in personally that suffering hurts, and that there are ways that we can use that suffering as the fuel to open up more fully to others and begin to see it's not just about me, but it's something we can actually hold and work with together. That's really what, it seems to me, Buddhist contribution to social justice work is all about. It's not just demonizing the enemy, but also including the enemy in the suffering we're working with in the world.
Thank you, Judith. When I think about the reflexes many of us have learned to immediately turn away from that suffering, it is a beautiful gift and a challenge to turn towards it.